In the spring of 1944, the roads of western Ukraine turned to a black, bottomless soup, and somewhere in that mud, 220,000 men of the German First Panzer Army were running for their lives. They were the best armoured force the enemy had left in the east. Tigers, Panthers, veterans who had survived Kursk and the long retreat across the Dnieper, and the Red Army had just slammed a steel ring shut around all of them. Into that exact moment, a new Soviet machine was rolling off the assembly lines at Chelyabinsk. A low, flat, brutal slab of armour, with a long gun jutting out the front like a spear. It did not look like a tank, it had no turret, but that gun could do something almost no Soviet vehicle had ever done before. It could hunt a tiger and win. This is the story of the ISU-122, and the months in 1944 when the Red Army stopped running from German heavy armour and started hunting it. But this story does not begin in the mud of 1944. It begins more than 10 years earlier, with a long steel barrel and a simple idea about reach. In the late 1920s, the men who ran Soviet artillery wanted a new kind of gun. Not a field piece for shooting at men in the open. They wanted a heavy gun for the corps level, a cannon that could sit miles behind the front and reach out to smash bridges, batteries, and strongpoints the smaller guns could never touch. The order went out in 1927. The design that answered it was a long, lean 122mm gun, and it was given the factory name A-19. It took years to get right. The first version came in the early 1930s. Then the designers did something clever and very Soviet. They took the long A-19 barrel and married it to the sturdy carriage of a big 152mm gun-howitzer, the ML-20. The two weapons shared the same set of wheels and trails, so a single workshop could service both. In 1939, the improved gun was accepted as the 122mm core gun, model 1931/37. The factories went on to build thousands of them. Remember that gun. Long barrel, high velocity, a shell built to fly for miles. In 1939, nobody was thinking of it as a tank killer. It was a long-range hammer for breaking fortifications. But that barrel was about to find a second life that its designers never imagined. Around the same time, in a different design hall, the Soviet Union was building the other half of this story, the heavy tank. In 1940, the Red Army put a monster into service called the KV. Named for a Soviet defense chief, it was a slab of thick armor on wide tracks, built to lead breakthroughs and shrug off anything the enemy could throw at it. And during the brutal winter war against Finland, Soviet crews ran into a problem the standard tank gun could not solve. The Finns hid behind thick concrete bunkers, and a normal tank shell just chipped the surface. So the engineers did a rush job. They dropped a huge 152mm howitzer into a tall, boxy turret on the KV hull, and called it the KV-2. It was a strange, top-heavy beast, slow and ungainly, and its turret could barely turn on a slope. But it proved one thing that mattered enormously for everything that came after. You could put a gun that big on a heavy Soviet hull and use it to blow apart anything that hid behind steel and concrete. The idea of the breakthrough gun was born. Hold those two threads in your mind. A long-range 122mm cannon built in the 30s, and a heavy hull proven able to carry a giant gun. They would not come together for years, and when they finally did, it would be because of a disaster that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union. That disaster came in the summer of 1941. When the German army stormed across the border, it drove straight for the heart of Soviet heavy industry. Leningrad, home of the Kirov plant that built the KV tanks, was about to be cut off and besieged. If those factories fell, the Red Army would lose the machines it needed to survive. So the Soviet leadership made one of the most staggering decisions of the entire war. They picked up their industry and moved it. Between the summer and the end of 1941, more than 1,500 factories were torn from their foundations, loaded piece by piece onto trains, and hauled east, beyond the reach of the German advance. Over 1.5 million rail cars rolled toward the Volga, the Urals, and Siberia. The Kirov Tank Works left Leningrad and travelled more than 1,000 miles east to a city on the far side of the Ural Mountains. Chelyabinsk. There, the Kirov machines merged with the Chelyabinsk tractor plant and a string of other relocated factories into a single colossus. The workers gave it a name that says everything: Tankograd, Tank City. It became the largest tank factory the world had ever seen. 60,000 workers by 1944. 3 shifts a day, every day, in cold that froze the breath in your throat. Whole families lived in the shadow of the assembly halls. Teenagers and old men worked the lathes when the young men went to the front. And out of those halls poured the heavy machines that would carry the Red Army west. By the end of the war, this one plant built more than 18,000 combat vehicles, a full fifth of everything the Soviet Union made. The KV tanks were born here. The IS tanks would be born here. And so would the gun that hunted tigers. But Tankograd could not yet build a tiger killer, because in 1943, the Red Army got a terrible shock. The German army had a new tank. The Tiger had first crept onto the Eastern Front near Leningrad in the autumn of 1942, but it was at the Great Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 that the Soviets felt its full weight, alongside a second new machine, the Panther. These were not the tanks the Red Army had been beating. The Tiger carried 100 millimeters of hardened steel on its face, and most Soviet guns simply bounced off it at any normal range. Crews learned to dread the moment a Tiger appeared on a ridgeline, because they often could not kill it before it killed them. They had to swarm it, flank it, trade 3 or 4 tanks to bring down one. The Red Army needed an answer, and it needed one fast. So, in the desperate winter before Kursk, the engineers reached back to that old idea: the breakthrough gun on a heavy hull. They took the KV chassis, dropped the big 152mm gun-howitzer into a fixed armoured box, and rushed the design from drawing board to prototype in about 25 days. It was accepted for service in February of 1943. They called it the ISU-122. It reached the front just in time for Kursk. And there, firing shells the size of fence posts, it did something nobody had expected. Tests on captured Tigers had hinted at it, and now the battlefield confirmed it. A direct hit from that monster gun could blow the turret clean off a Tiger. It wrecked Panthers. It cracked open the heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers. German crews started calling these vehicles the Beast. Soviet crews turned that into a badge of honor and gave it the nickname Zveroboy, the Beast Killer. Kursk taught the Red Army a doctrine it would carry to Berlin: group these heavy guns into their own regiments, hold them back from the front line, then unleash them where the German armor was thickest as a hammer of last resort. The heavy, self-propelled regiment was now a permanent part of how the Soviets fought. But the Su-152 had a problem. The KV hull underneath it was old, and the army was already building something better: the new IS heavy tank, named for the Soviet leader himself. So the engineers moved the whole concept onto the new chassis. They took the IS hull, bolted an armoured box on top, and slid in the big gun howitzer. They called it the ISU-152. The Beast Killer had a new body. And here is where the real story starts. Because there was a second problem hiding behind the first. The Soviet Union was running short on those big gun howitzer barrels. The factories could not make enough of them to fill every hull coming off the line. So, someone in the design bureau asked a simple question. We have all these finished heavy hulls sitting here, with no gun to put in them. What other big gun do we have plenty of? The answer was sitting in the artillery parks. The A-19, that long, lean 122mm field gun, the core cannon Soviet gunners had been firing since the 1930s. Long barrel, high velocity. And critically, there were thousands of them. far more than the big howitzers. So the engineers married the two threads at last. The old long-range A-19 barrel went into the new heavy ISU hull. They modified the breech for the cramped fighting compartment and called the gun the A-19S. And just like that, almost by accident, the Red Army had built one of the most dangerous tank destroyers of the entire war. They named it the ISU-122. Now, to understand why this thing mattered so much, you have to understand what the A-19 actually threw downrange. The standard armor-piercing shell weighed about 55 pounds. Let that number sit for a second. 55 pounds of steel, leaving the barrel at roughly 2,600 feet per second. Most tank guns of the war fired a shell you could lift with one hand. The ISU-122 fired a shell that a man had to heave with both arms, and it hit like a wrecking ball dropped from a crane. The kinetic energy in that round was simply on another level from what German tank crews were used to facing. That was the gift of the old core gun. It had been built for reach and power against fortifications. And that same reach and power turned out to be exactly what you needed to smash a tank. And that changes the whole math of a tank fight. For 2 years, the German Tiger had been a nightmare for Soviet crews. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters of hardened steel, and most Soviet guns simply bounced off it. The men had learned to dread it. They had paid in burning tanks for every Tiger they took down. The ISU-122 ended that arrangement. That 55-pound shell, the BR-471, could punch through roughly 6.5 inches of armor at half a mile, and well over 6 inches at a full mile. A Tiger's 100mm front was a little under 4 inches. Do the subtraction. At normal combat range, the ISU-122 did not bounce off a Tiger. It went straight through the front of it. Think about what that meant for the men inside that fighting compartment. For the first time, they could sit still, take aim at the most feared tank in the German army, and expect to win the exchange. But the gun had a darker trick, and German crews learned it fast. A shell that heavy does not need to fully punch through to ruin your day. Even when the round did not penetrate clean, the sheer mass and shock of impact could crack welds, shatter armor plate from the inside, snap the gun out of alignment, and kill or wound the crew through pure blunt force. German tankers reported turrets jammed solid, optics smashed, and men knocked senseless by hits that technically failed to penetrate. A Tiger that could not turn its gun and could not see was a dead Tiger, whether the steel was holed or not. So yes, this was a tank killer. But it was a very specific kind of tank killer, and we need to be honest about that, because it is where the legend usually gets stretched. The Panther was a different animal from the Tiger. Its frontal glacis was not as thick, but it was sloped at a vicious angle, and that slope made it shrug off shells that would have cracked a vertical plate. Even the mighty A-19 could not reliably smash a Panther through its sloped front plate at close range with the 1944 ammunition. The crews knew it, so they did what good gunners do. They aimed for the gun mantlet. They waited for the flank. They used that monstrous shell against the weaker side armor, where the Panther had nowhere to hide. And when a 55-pound round caught a Panther in the side, there was very little left to recover. There is a reason this vehicle earned the respect it did, and it was not marketing. It was the simple fact that a single hit usually ended the conversation. It was not a perfect weapon. No weapon is. The biggest weakness was speed. Not road speed, firing speed. That huge gun fired separate ammunition, which means the shell and the propellant charge were loaded as two pieces, by hand, in a cramped steel box. A good crew managed maybe 2 rounds a minute. Some sources say as few as 1.5. Against a fast-moving target, against several targets at once, that slow rhythm could get you killed. You got your shot. You had better make it count. Then you waited, exposed, while the loader wrestled the next round home. The armor was modest too. The front of the fighting compartment was about 3.5 inches thick, enough to stop lighter guns, but not enough to laugh off a German heavy round. This was an ambush predator, not a brawler. It was built to see first, shoot first, and kill first. Get caught in a slugging match at close range, and it could die like anything else. And the crew of 5 worked in a box thick with smoke and the deafening crash of that cannon, half blind to the world outside, trusting the commander's eyes and the driver's nerve. It was hard, dangerous work, but the men who crewed these machines were about to get the kind of targets they had been dreaming about. Because, while the engineers at Tankograd were finishing the ISU-122, 800 miles to the west, the German army in Ukraine was walking into a catastrophe. The 4th of March, 1944. Western Ukraine. The Red Army opened the Proskurov-Chernovtsy offensive with a wall of artillery fire. This was the first Ukrainian front, and it had a new commander. Marshal Zhukov himself had taken the reins after the previous commander, Vatutin, was mortally wounded in an ambush. Zhukov had a plan, and it was enormous. He was going to trap an entire German army. The target was the First Panzer Army, the armoured fist of the German forces in the south, commanded by General Hans Valentin Hube. Hube was a tough, one-armed veteran, respected even by his enemies, and his army was packed with exactly the heavy tanks the ISU-122 had been built to kill. Tigers, Panthers, the cream of the German armoured force. Zhukov's first Ukrainian front would drive down from the north. Konev's second Ukrainian front would swing up from the southeast. 2 massive pincers, closing on Hube's army from opposite directions, aiming to meet behind it and seal it off. And the ground itself became a weapon. It was the season the Russians call the Rasputitsa, the thaw. The frozen earth turned to a sea of mud so deep that trucks vanished to their axles, and men lost their boots in it. The Germans had counted on that mud to slow the Soviet advance to a crawl. Instead, the Red Army kept coming, hauling guns and supplies forward by sheer brute will, while the mud trapped the heavy German tanks that should have been their salvation. Tigers and Panthers, the most powerful machines on the battlefield, sat bogged and useless, burning their last fuel, while the ring closed around them. By the 24th of March, it was done. Hube's First Panzer Army, more than 200,000 men, was surrounded. Trapped in a pocket near the town of Kamenets-Podolsky, its back to a river, its supply lines cut, its tanks running dry. The Germans had a name for these traps. They called them Cauldrons. And this was one of the biggest of the entire war. Up in the German High Command, there was something close to panic. The man responsible for this front was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the most respected general the Germans had in the East. He knew exactly what a lost army of 200,000 men would mean. So he fought hard to convince his superiors to let Hube try a breakout to the west, rather than ordering him to stand and die in place. The pressure was immense. In fact, within days, the entire command structure was torn up. Army Group South, the formation that had held this part of the front for years, was reorganized and renamed Army Group North Ukraine. That is how serious the crisis had become. The names on the map were being rewritten in real time as the front collapsed. Manstein got his approval. Hube would break out. And the trapped army began the most desperate gamble of its existence, punching west through the mud and the snow and the Soviet armor, trying to claw a corridor back to friendly lines. If you are getting value from this breakdown, take 1 second and subscribe. We dig into the weapons and battles of the Eastern Front the way they actually happened, not the way the legends tell it. By early April, the trapped Germans were grinding westward through a gauntlet of fire. On the 6th of April, the lead elements of Hube's army finally linked hands with a relief force near the town of Buchach, cracking open a thin escape corridor. Over the next few days, the Red Army's pressure never let up. But the corridor held just long enough. By the 10th of April, the bulk of the First Panzer Army had streamed out of the Cauldron. Now, the German propaganda machine called this a miracle, a great escape. And it is true that most of the men got out alive. But look closer at what actually escaped. The men walked out. The army did not. To break free, Hube's force had to abandon almost everything that made it an army. The heavy equipment was left behind in the mud. The tanks that ran out of fuel were blown up by their own crews or simply left where they died. The big guns, the trucks, the workshops, the supply dumps, all of it gone. What crossed back to German lines was an exhausted mob of survivors who had thrown away their teeth to keep their lives. And here is the irony that history loves. Hans Valentin Hube, the one-armed general who led that breakout, the man hailed as the savior of the First Panzer Army, was killed a few weeks later. Not in battle, in a plane crash on his way back from receiving a medal for the very escape he had just led. The Cauldron had not destroyed his army outright, but it had broken it. The First Panzer Army that limped out of Ukraine in April 1944 was a shadow of the force that had been trapped, stripped of the heavy armour it would never fully replace. So where does the ISU-122 fit into all of this? Here is the honest answer, and it is more interesting than the myth. The ISU-122 was being born in the exact weeks that the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket was closing and breaking open. It was adopted for service in the middle of March, just as Hube's army was being surrounded. The first machines rolled out of Tankograd in April, as the survivors of that pocket were staggering back to German lines. The mud campaigns of Ukraine, where German heavy tanks proved so dangerous and so hard to kill, were exactly the kind of fighting that screamed for a weapon like this. The Red Army had spent the entire winter and spring of 1944 learning a hard lesson over and over again. To beat the German heavy tanks, you needed a gun big enough to kill them in one shot, mounted on a hull tough enough to take the field. The ISU-122 was the answer to that lesson, forged in the same season as the great encirclements in the south. Everything that came before, the old core gun, the heavy KV hull, the beast killers of Kursk, the doctrine of the heavy regiment, it all flowed into this one low, flat machine at exactly the right moment. And once it reached the front in numbers, it changed how the Red Army fought. By the summer of 1944, when the Soviet Union launched its colossal offensive to destroy Army Group Center, the new heavy assault gun regiments were there in force. The ISU-122 and its sister, the ISU-152, rolled forward as the heavy hammer of the breakthrough, used exactly the way Kursk had taught. When German Tigers and Panthers tried to plug the gaps and counterattack, they ran into these low, flat killers and their 55-pound shells. The hunter and the hunted had traded places. For 2 years, the Tiger had been the predator on the Eastern Front, the machine that made Soviet crews flinch. Now there was a Soviet vehicle that could sit on a ridge, let a Tiger roll into range, and put a round straight through the front of it before the German crew could do a thing about it. The fear started flowing the other way. The ISU-122 was not the fastest, it was not the best armoured. It fired slowly and it fought half-blind. But it had the one quality that mattered most against German heavy armour. It hit harder than almost anything else on the battlefield, and one good hit was usually all it needed. The factory men at Tankograd kept the lines running. By the end of the war, they had built more than 1,700 of the original ISU-122, plus hundreds of an improved version with a faster loading gun, the ISU-122S, which roughly doubled the rate of fire and fixed the weapon's worst weakness. These machines fought all the way to Berlin. In the brutal street fighting of the German capital, that same 122mm gun that had been built to kill tanks in the open found a second life smashing fortified buildings, blowing holes in walls and bunkers, clearing the path for the infantry house by house. And there is a strange justice in that. The barrel had been designed back in the 30s to break fortifications. In the rubble of Berlin, it went home to the job it was born for. The ambush predator of the open steppe became a siege weapon in the city it had marched 1,000 miles to reach. And it all traced back to that long-range core gun from the 1930s, a heavy hull proven against Finnish bunkers, a factory hauled 1,000 miles east to escape the German advance, and a simple question asked in a freezing design hall. We have these hulls, what gun can we put in them? The answer turned out to be one of the deadliest tank destroyers the Red Army ever fielded. The men of the First Panzer Army escaped their Cauldron in the spring of 1944, but they left their tanks dead in the Ukrainian mud, and they never got the steel back. Meanwhile, in the east, the machine that would hunt the survivors of those panzer divisions across the next 1,000 miles was just rolling off the line, gun pointed west, waiting for the order to advance. The era when a German Tiger could rule the battlefield by fear alone was ending, and a low, flat, ugly slab of Soviet steel with a 55-pound punch was one of the weapons that ended it.